This is Professor Ewing, and I want to do a short explanatory video of the two topics. Really, the first one is Judaism, and more specifically, mysticism and the Jewish tradition. This is designed, this is designed for you to follow along the PowerPoint that's referred to as Judaism and Kabbalah 2020. You should see that in the PowerPoints area. And so I will go over the slides, and I will try to be as concise and brief as possible. So if you open up your PowerPoint, and I'm going to do that, I'm going to try to do that now. The first page you see is the title page called Judaism and Kabbalah, or Kabbalah. Kabbalah is a mystical tradition within the world religion of Judaism. And it traces its roots back to, obviously, the great prophets in the history of early Israelite religion, Moses predominantly. I will speak briefly about him. But also one of the later prophets, Isaiah. He's roughly 700 BCE, so he comes significantly, chronologically speaking, after the time of Moses. A few of the other later prophets, Ezekiel is a priest during the time of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, and his book is referred to by name as the Book of Ezekiel. He has various visions in that that are recounted in that book. The first one comes pretty early on in chapter 1, and it's a vision of the Lord on a chariot. And so that was some of these mystical visions that are referred to in Kabbalah refer back to these prophets of the Hebrew Bible. So first page, what are we looking at? We're looking at a manuscript, a page from a manuscript of a Spanish Hebrew Bible. There were Jews that lived under the Muslim rule in Spain during the Middle Ages, and ultimately the Spanish territory was reconquered. It's called the Reconquista in Spanish, by the Spanish Catholic monarchs who were Christians, and ultimately, in the name of their crusade of the retaking the Iberian Peninsula in the year 1492, it was decreed that all non-baptized people who would not accept conversion into the Roman Catholic Church, namely Jews and Muslims, would be expelled from Spanish territory. Some Jews stayed in Spain and decided to essentially coexist. Many of these were baptized. They were called the conversos in Spanish, i.e. the converted. There's a long tradition, a long history of that. Many of these Jews publicly would convert to Roman Catholic Christianity, and then they would keep their Jewish practices in the home, privately speaking, the Passover, the Shabbat, etc. And so this mystical tradition that was nurtured in the Middle Ages develops during this period as well. And then later, Kabbalah gets associated with some of the Hasidim in what would now be Poland and Ukraine, sort of Eastern Europe. And it carries forward into the modern period. And so alongside with the traditional forms of Judaism is this mystical way of interpreting some of these prophetic visions and some of the enduring symbols that we find. For example, the tree of life, and I'll go into that. But we're looking at this illuminated manuscript of a Spanish Bible. It's dated to 1384, so you can see it's about a century previous to the Reconquista or the reconquering of Catholic Spain. And this is a scribe's image of what's referred to in Greek as the tetragrammaton. It literally means 4 letters. And so you see the Yod He Vav He, forgive my pronunciation in Hebrew. This is associated with the sacred name of God. And at a certain point in the history of early Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, the sacred name would only be pronounced in the holy place or the Holy of Holies in the temple by the high priest on the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And after the Second Temple was destroyed, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. It probably already to that point was not pronounced by lay people out loud, or they might not have even known how to pronounce it, but it gets associated with something that shouldn't be said out loud, something that should only be said in the holy place, and again by the high priest. So ultimately, we don't really know how this was pronounced in the ancient period, but it gets associated with Moses and the revelation of the Creator, the unseen God, at the burning bush experience. If you go to the next slide, you'll see Rembrandt's a close-up of Rembrandt's version of Moses bringing down the tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments. This is accounted for in 2 different books of the Torah. By tradition, Moses is considered by Orthodox Jews to be the author of the Torah, right? He, in a sense, is God's secretary, Yahweh's secretary. And so he simply faithfully copies down the law. Torah in Hebrew literally translates into English as teaching. But loosely, Torah has also been translated as simply law, and sometimes it's referred to as Mosaic law or the law of Moses. The 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. These are Greek terms when the Bible was translated from Hebrew into the Greek language. But there are 2 places in the entire Torah that refer specifically to what we call the 10 Commandments. The more dramatic of the 2 is in the book of Exodus, the 2nd book, and it takes place literally halfway through the book, 40 chapters, and it takes place in the 20th chapter, the revelation at Sinai of the 10 sayings, or the 10 Commandments, as they're referred to in English. They're also referred to in Deuteronomy, the early part of the book. The term Deuteronomy is a Greek term, as I've mentioned. Zephteros is second, and nomos is law. So Deuteronomia is literally a second law. It's a second revelation of the law that's ascribed to Moses. So you have a second version of the 10 sayings, or the 10 Commandments, and some interpretation of those also given in the early part of the book of Deuteronomy. Moses is referred to by various titles in the history of Judaism, and later in Christianity, which comes out of Judaism. at least Palestinian Judaism, the time of Jesus, early 1st century CE. Jesus is referred to by his disciples as Rabbi, our master, our teacher. And this would be traditional in Palestinian Judaism. Various disciples would attach themselves to someone who was seen as qualified to teach Torah, to teach law, and give his interpretation on that. And hence, the early Christians were predominantly Jews. Jesus himself was raised in the tradition of Judaism. And we know that from various signals in the canonical Christian Gospels. The Gospel of Luke talks about Jesus being offered in the temple, his parents following the Mosaic law there. He's circumcised on the 8th day after his birth, and he's given a traditional name, Yeshua, which in Greek becomes Jesus. His name in Hebrew is Joshua. And so Christianity, in a sense, doesn't really make sense if you don't understand the Jewish context. And even the idea that Jesus is the Christ, right, in early Christianity, that he's the Messiah, the anointed king, to rule over Israel. None of that makes sense without understanding Moses and the Torah and the later Hebrew prophets, as they're referred to in the Jewish Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. Moses is referred to as the lawgiver, right? The bestower of the law, the one who meets God face to face and receives the 10 sayings or the 10 commandments. He's also referred to as the God seer, right? In the tradition, right, the Bible specifically says that no one can really behold God, but some of the prophets have visions of Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God, as he's manifested. Moses goes away from the people. That's significant. He prepares himself and fasts, and he's up on the mountain away from the people, and he's prepared himself and purified himself for this divine revelation. Ultimately, Yahweh walks by Moses, and Moses is hidden in a cleft of the mountain, and he's only allowed to see the backside of God, so to speak, because God's glory is so overwhelming. But he is still referred to in Judeo-Christian tradition as Moses, the God seer, the one who was so holy in a sense that he could talk face to face with God. If you go to Exodus chapter 3, that's where you're going to see a foundational story that's recounted there. Moses is raised in Pharaoh's house in the first chapter of Exodus, and there's all sorts of signs that are given that he's unique amongst babies to be born. Even his name is somewhat mysterious. It has its meaning in Hebrew, Moshe, but it's really Egyptian. Moses means offspring of or son of, and usually in a pharaonic title, a title of an Egyptian pharaoh, they would have the name of an Egyptian deity or god who would go before that. So if you think of like Tutmosis, the god Thoth, right, the Egyptian god of wisdom, the pharaoh would bear that god's name, and he would literally be a son of Thoth, right, a son of Tut. Ramses, and there were various pharaohs that took that name. Again, a son of Ra, right, a son of the solar deity, the god that was primary in Egyptian religion and was associated with the solar disk, with the sun. So we have examples of Ramses the first, Ramses the second, and they were literally a son of Ra. Moses comes along and he's simply son of, with no Egyptian deity appended to that. So that's sort of a mysterious detail about him. He's very mysterious. He's said in Exodus chapter 1 to be a Hebrew, his parents from the tribe of Levi, and hence later his brother Aaron or Harun becomes the prototypical priest, and all of the priests in Israelite religion then were descended from Moses' tribe and Aaron's tribe, his brother, the tribe of Levi. Moses is shepherding. He's out. He has fled Egypt because he's murdered or killed vengefully an Egyptian taskmaster who was abusing some of the Hebrew slaves. And so Moses kills this taskmaster according to the early chapters of the book of Exodus, and he flees into the desert for a long, long period of time. 40 years, it's an idealized period. And as he's working as a shepherd in this desert place, he sees this bush that's it's burning, but it's not consumed. And that gets interpreted in various ways. There are some who try to interpret that text literally and say that, oh, there was this kind of bush, that had some sort of resin, and it would be able to burn, but it wouldn't be consumed in a sense. Excuse me. There are others that see that as an allegory in a sense, that the bush that is on fire and yet is not consumed is a manifestation or an outward symbol of the glory of the unseen God. And so Moses, in a sense, is the veil is taken off of his eyes. And this would be important for those in mystical traditions who look at these accounts as manifestations of divinity, right? Theophany, the outward manifestation of the inner mystery of the divine light, right? The divinity, the essence of God. Although in later Jewish tradition, some of the rabbis talk about the essence of Yahweh, right? That he's so beyond the human mind that no one can see God, right? So even in the way that these texts are interpreted, if you read the account in Exodus chapter 3, it says an angel of Yahweh, right? An angel of the Lord. And so already we have this notion that there has to be some sort of intermediary, that you can't directly access the mystery that is God, the creator, right? And so there's this voice or this intermediary that speaks from the bush to Moses and says, Moses, Moses. And this is really his calling. He's going to deliver the Hebrew slaves, bring them out, form them as a nation, take them to the boundary of the land that is promised, give them a law, and begin to shape them as a nation which will be unified with God, or will pledge its allegiance to God. So let me just stop there as far as Moses goes. This experience that he has is foundational, though, for later mysticism and Kabbalah. The name that is revealed to Moses, right? This divine name, I am the one who is, or I am the one who has always been, or will always exist. I am the I am, right? It's interesting because Moses says, when I go to the sons of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and tell them that God has sent me, they're going to say, what's his name, right? And he says, so what is your name, essentially? Now this is interesting because in the history of the patriarchs previous to the time of Moses, Abraham, etc., God is referred to as El, and then with an attribute. So the God who sees, or the God who is all powerful, the Almighty, the God who hears, the God who delivers, etc. God with an attribute. And so here's the first time that we have God revealing himself or itself by use of a name, right? A participle, something that is tied to his essence. And hence later in Judaism, this notion that the name could not be pronounced or spoken out loud. And only the high priest would pronounce this on a certain day of the year in the Jewish Second Temple. And then ultimately that name, as I've referred to, falls out of usage, and it gets replaced in Hebrew scripture with Adonai, my Lord. And that gets translated into various languages. And so in the Torah, in English translations, you will see Lord sometimes in block capitals, and that's referring to that sacred name there. Okay, if we go on to Isaiah, as I've said, he is a later Hebrew prophet. In the 6th chapter of the book of Isaiah, you could take a look at this. He has this vision of the Lord in the temple. That's a significant detail. And it's a very mystical vision. It's the calling of the prophet Isaiah. And he sees around the throne of Yahweh, he sees what are referred to as seraphs, seraphim in the Hebrew, it's a plural. And these have 6 wings. They're not human-like. They're creatures, and with 2 of the wings, they cover their faces. With 2 of their set of wings, they hover, really. And with 2 other wings, they cover their feet, which is probably a sign of their that they're in the immediate presence of God on the throne, on his throne. And so they're covering their feet, which would be a sign of their modesty, right? Even though they're angelic creatures. And so this becomes foundational as well. Holy, 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 the Lord of Sabaoth, or the Lord of hosts. And if you go to the next slide, you will see, if you touch on the link in the slide with the scroll of Isaiah there, you'll see the words holy, 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 Kadosh, 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 Adonai, Sabaoth. It's holy, holy, holy 3 times, the thrice holy. And that's what these seraphim are chanting around the throne of Yahweh Elohim in the Temple of Jerusalem. And this is the vision that Isaiah sees. You can hear a modern version of those Hebrew terms being chanted meditatively. So later in Kabbalah, the word itself simply means that which is received, i.e. Tradition, some sort of mystical method or way of interpreting the Hebrew scriptures in allegorical and symbolic ways. See a couple of modern renditions of what is referred to as the tree of life, and this gets very involved. A lot of interesting poetry comes out of some of these Jewish mystics in the Middle Ages. Isaac of Luria, there are a few others, and they write some very beautiful poetry where they meditate on the tree of life and on the seraphim and the throne, the chariot of God. The prophet Ezekiel refers to that vision in the 1st chapter of the book of Ezekiel, where he sees the Lord on a chariot. And again, there are these angelic creatures that are surrounding the chariot, in a sense, guarding the throne of God. So in Kabbalah, this notion the Ein Sof, right? The infinite. God is infinite and infinitely mysterious. And therefore, in creation, there are his manifestations. And you can see those numbered here in the graphic version of this on the right of the PowerPoint. The tree of life is an enduring symbol across religions and across cultures, which is an interesting detail. They either call it the tree of life, or they call it in different cultures. They might call it the world tree. So, like the Maya had a version of this, the world tree, and it's tied into their cosmology, the way that they viewed how the world worked and how the universe was set up, etc. But in Kabbalah and Judaism, there are these sephirot, these 10 manifestations or emanations of the Ein Sof, of the infinite, the boundless. And so the tree of life symbol, it becomes a symbol, and it's picked up. You can find this in predominantly chapters 2 and 3 of the first book of the Hebrew Bible, right? The book of Genesis. Immediately after the creation story in chapter 1, you have the man, Ha-Adam, right? Formed from the dust of the ground in chapter 2. And then out of his side is drawn forth the mother of all the living, Hava, right? Eve in English, she is the mother of life. And in Greek, her name is Zoe, right? Which is the Greek term for life, literally. So she becomes the source of life, right? The idea of the first parents and their differentiation. And that takes place in chapter 2. They have access in the garden of paradise to this tree of life. But they also have access to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they are tempted by the serpent. And you can read about that in the 3rd chapter. And then God finds out, and he curses the man and he curses the woman, and they pass the buck, and ultimately the serpent is cursed. And then it's an interesting detail, but at the very end of this account of the formation of the first parents and their life in paradise, the garden, and then their fall via temptation, they're expelled from this life of where the earth offers itself voluntarily, and they're condemned to pain and suffering and labor and sweating, and ultimately they're expulsed from this garden because God says the man has become like one of us, knowing between good and evil. He can differentiate between those two, and lest he stretch forth his hand to the tree of life and essentially become God, let us expel him. And so cherubim are set at the eastern point, however that's interpreted, with fiery swords. And so there's this notion that man, in a sense, becomes mortal because he's not worthy to taste of the tree of life. And so hence, one of the notions in the Kabbalistic mystical tradition is, how can we have access to that again? How can we have access to the infinite, right? The divine name and the divine essence. And so the tree of life becomes an intersecting point, which really joins the created, manifested world and the unseen world, or the world of the boundless, right? The world of God, the spiritual life, the spiritual realm. Last couple of slides, and then I'll wrap this up. You can see some versions of the tree of life as a worldwide symbol. The carving on your left is, you can see the tree here, and I think this comes from an Assyrian description One thing to mention is that, as I've said, the tree of life is in a lot of different traditions and cultures. The one on your right, I like this one because the fruit on the tree is portrayed as pomegranates, and that is also very interesting. Even the term for paradise that we find in Islam, in Christianity, and Judaism, most likely derived from ancient Persian, paradiso, and I don't know how it was pronounced, but this comes down into the other languages as this walled garden. And so it's interesting that the pomegranate, probably because of its shape, becomes a symbol of the womb of life, right? The uterus, if you think about it literally. A pomegranate is somewhat shaped like a uterus. And so in the Near East, in Persian culture, in Semitic culture, the pomegranate and also the fig, depending on, some of the rabbis say, oh, the fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of these trees in the Garden of Eden were probably fig trees, although the fruit is not specifically mentioned in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. But the pomegranate, some speculate that the pomegranate was the original fruit in a sense, but it becomes symbolic of life and the tree of life and access to eternity in that sense. If you go to the final slide here, on the left is a close-up of a military helmet, and you can see some kings or some princes, and then there's this tree of life symbol in the middle. This is very old. This comes from what would now be territorially Armenia. The Armenians were an ancient culture, but even previous to that, there were peoples who lived in that region around Lake Van, in the Caucasian mountain area there, kind of the gateway between Europe and the Near East or the Middle East. And so here again, this probably comes from around 900 BCE, so it's almost 3,000 years old. And this would have been a military helmet for either a prince or possibly someone who was noble. And they would have embossed as a symbol, as a protective symbol on their helmet going into battle, a symbol of the tree of life. The photograph on your right hand is from the modern day. This is from Bahrain. You can see it's a very deserty like region. And there's in Arabic, they refer to a certain type of tree as literally the tree of life, because this one here, I think, is about 500 years old. But these trees are able to survive in the desert, in the dead place, and they're simply referred to as trees of life. So very interesting how this symbol endures not only in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but in various of the world's cultures. This symbol of the world tree, or the tree of eternity, or the tree of the source of life, tree of life, pops up. So let me go ahead and stop this intro video here. We're at about a little over half an hour, and just wanted to inform you of some of the sources of Jewish Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition, and then talk about some of the symbols and some of the visions that were foundational